So one of the questions that archaeologists have been asking is, um, what was the main incentive to develop pottery in the ancient Middle East? And can we tell this by looking at the kinds of vessels that they first made? Because as we said before, the invention of pottery was not timed based on the appearance of the technology, because the technology was there for a while. It looks like the development of pottery was connected to agriculture and to people settling down and becoming sedentary, because once you become sedentary and you're no longer a mobile hunter and gatherer, you can start to accumulate things, you can store things, and this is when people started to become more interested, it looks like, in permanent containers. So storage pits, but also other kinds of containers that could be waterproofed. So one of the earliest experiments in these kind of containers predates pottery. It dates the time period of agriculture in the Middle East. And it's a reed basket that's coated with lime plaster on the inside and the outside. Now this would have some use, but obviously would not be as good as ceramic. So one of the ways that archaeologists can try and come up with to explain the timing of pottery in the Middle East is to look at the kinds of vessels that were made early on in what we call the Neolithic, the pottery Neolithic. So what you can see here are lots of kind of open mouth jars, wide jars, and bowls. And here's like a platter. You don't have large storage jars in this period. You also do not have small storage jars that would be used for liquid. There's no evidence that the pot, even though the pottery extends over a certain area, there's no evidence that the pottery itself was being manufactured to trade. And so when you put all this together, you can see that they used granaries to store their grain rather than large storage jars. When you put all this together, it looks like the earliest uses for pottery had to do with cooking and also with serving food. And so the ability to directly cook, and this is why pottery is so useful, because you could have a fire, you could suspend a pot or place a pot on a fire in many different ways, but this gives you the ability to direct cooking. Without pottery, it's very hard to cook something like a stew or broth or something like that. The way people would probably do it before pottery is to have some sort of leather sack with the contents inside of it. Then they would heat up stones in the fire, place the stones in the sack, and that would heat up the contents. And that was not very efficient. This is a very efficient way. And so, again, cooking vessels tend to be medium, thin, not the thinnest vessels, but not too thick, because if they were too thick, the heat would not transfer well to the inside, to the contents inside. So what was the development? What was the incentive to develop pottery in the ancient Middle East? Cooking and serving. And you can see some of these really nice serving bowls. And so this might be connected not only to agriculture and being settled down, but to some of those early societies we talked about, like tribes or big men societies, where feasting is a big part and gift giving is a big part of the power of these big men. Right? And so the cooking and the eating may have been also in the context of feasting in these societies, which made even greater incentive to develop durable containers that looked nice. Okay, so you're going to see how to analyze sherds. All the sherds that you're going to look at are what are called rim sherds, like you can see over here, the rim or the top of the vessel. Many times what you'll have on an archaeological site are what we call body sherds. None of the rim or the base is preserved. The sherd has broken edges on all sides. Now, you can gain certain information from pottery. From these body sherds, you can tell, let's say, how they made the vessel, the decoration, but you can't tell if it was a bowl or if it was a jar. And so you may not be able to get at the use or the function of the vessel as easily as you would with a rim sherd, because with a rim sherd, you can tell the approximate size and what kind of vessel it was. And I'm gonna show you how to do this in just a sec. So many of you have probably made pots before, some maybe in the studio or just some kind of an art class. The wheel was developed early on in the Middle East. This is an Egyptian statue. Many people think the wheel was first developed for carts, but actually it's more likely that the wheel was invented and developed for pottery, because a large wheel, heavy wheel, that could be spun makes throwing pots and manufacturing pottery much more efficient. So typically the first step in pottery is to get the clay. As we said, you know what clay is. It's fine-grained earth that is plastic when mixed with water. Kneading the clay would push out any air bubbles. You don't want air bubbles in your vessel, because when you put in the kiln, the air will expand and cause the vessel to crack. You might also mix the clay with different kinds of non-plastic substances that retain their shape and size, and this is what is known as temper. They reduce the shrinkage of the clay as it dries and lessens the chance that the vessel will break when it is fired. Typically, vessels that have very little temper show much greater skill in manufacture. Sherds that have lots of temper are sort of more easily made. So this, you can see sand in the temper. You also notice that's not evenly fired, right? There's different colors within the clay. Same here as well. So it was not fired completely through. This is grit temper, or small pebbles, small rocks. You could have limestone temper, you can see here, and also fiber temper like straw, chaff. A lot of the times that material obviously will burn in the kiln, and you're left with hollow spaces in the sherd. Besides the wheel, there's coil made techniques and also slab techniques. We're taking slabs and sticking them together. You probably have made pinch pots before. There's mold making as well, but with coil making, you put one coil on top of another. You can see this in a lot of early Native American vessels, and you can still find it today. Sometimes with broken pottery, you can tell if it was wheel made or coil made, because sometimes the coils are actually separating. Also, the vessel will not be evenly thick. You saw this with your typology exercise. With wheel-made vessels, it tends to be more uniform, and you also have, as I'll show you, those striations that show that was thrown on a wheel. Occasionally, because of uneven drying, you might get cracks in the vessel, right? And this would not be worth repairing. They would probably throw this vessel out and start over again. But here you can see on a ceramic these kinds of what look like phonograph or vinyl record lines from throwing the pot, from putting the clay on the wheel, and then using your hands to stretch the clay upwards. After that, people would scrape the outside and the inside of the vessel, maybe to thin out the walls, and then decorate the outside. There are many different techniques. What you'll see with some of the sherds that I'm going to have you look at is they could be stamped with a paddle that has decorations carved on the wood, or they could have rope or cord tied around kind of like a wooden batten and pressed into the wet clay to create different designs. A rim could also be created on the top of the vessel. You're going to see rims like this when you analyze the pottery I'm going to give you, and you'll end up something like this. This is a typical cooking vessel that you would find in North American Midwest. And then you would fire it. Right? And there are different ways to fire it. Firing it this way, kind of on an open sort of bonfire, would fire the clay enough that it would be pretty impervious to water. It would not reach the highest temperatures. To do that, you would have some sort of you would need to have some sort of kiln like this, where there's a draft below, so that you can get really, really high temperatures. And highly fired clay is more durable and less porous. Okay, so let's look at what you're going to do.